Uh, Thank you, Amrit and Paula. And what an amazing presentation that was, and so comprehensive, and just segues so well into now giving some really practical examples of how human rights approaches in service delivery can really facilitate and assist service providers, non-government service providers. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Bidjigal and Gadigal country in coastal Sydney, the land of the great First Nations warrior Pemulwuy, who united so many of the local First Nations peoples here in the struggle against colonialism. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging in all the places and countries that we're meeting on today. I'm going to start with a quote, and I was reminded of this quote very much when Paula and Amrit were speaking about where do human rights really begin. And it's the quote from essentially the architect of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And I really wanted to start with that quote because often we think of discussions around human rights as being very much high up in that international global field at the UN, and it's a place for lawyers and academics. But I'd actually suggest that it's actually in direct service provision that real change in human rights takes place. And in this regard, it's thinking about why you're involved in the organisations that you're involved in, why you're involved in service delivery. And it's very much motivated by that essential respect of wanting to assist people, wanting to assist those who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged. And in that respect, service providers in organisations, in service organisations such as that you're involved in, are really key in implementing a human rights culture in society. And in that respect, I want to start off with that sense that you are really the agents of change. The change is not going to come from lawyers and academics and government. It's very much going to come from service providers and also service users. So with that in mind, I want to have a look at the experience of human rights and service provision in the 3 Australian jurisdictions which have legislated human rights charters, human rights acts in Victoria, ACT and Queensland. And I think it's really important to look at the way that service organisations in those states and territories have really been at the forefront of really creating that human rights culture. So I guess just to start with, the legal requirements in those states. So in the ACT, ACT was the first jurisdiction in Australia to implement a Human Rights Act in 2004, closely followed by the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act in Victoria in 2006. I had the privilege to be working on the drafting and implementation of that legislation whilst I worked in government in Victoria. And then most recently, we also saw the enactment of a Human Rights Act in Queensland in 2018. And I think just to start with, in the lead up to those pieces of legislation, the roles of VCOSS, ACTCOSS and QCOSS in being a voice of advocacy for implementing, enacting those human rights acts, those human rights protections, and then implementing those acts across their services was so critical. In those states and territories, the role of non-government organisations in advocating for additional human rights protections was so important in those acts coming into being. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the legal ingredients of those acts, save it except for that They are pieces of ordinary legislation. They're not embedded in a constitution. So they're ordinary acts of parliament, and predominantly they recognise and articulate civil and political rights. There are some economic and social and cultural rights in the Queensland Act and the ACT Act, mainly the right to education and the right to health services. And all of the acts provide particular recognition of cultural rights for First Nations people as well. But I would encourage you to have a look at the rights that are protected in those acts. But I think importantly for today is to look at that in each of those acts, there is an obligation on public authorities to act in a way that is compatible with the human rights that are protected in those acts, and to make it unlawful for a public authority to act in a manner which is incompatible with a human right. And it's also unlawful for a public authority in making a decision to fail to give proper consideration to a relevant human right. So that immediately gives rise to the question, what is a public authority? So it includes government bodies, departments, government institutions, local government, police, government departments, prisons, but it also includes non-government bodies performing functions of a public nature. And this idea of what is a function of a public nature, there's some guidance in the legislation as to what's included in that regard. So there's discussion about whether it's a function conferred by law. Is it a function that is identified with the functions of government? So for instance, in the case of prisons, private prisons, well, the idea of managing a correctional facility is identified with a function of government. So it would also include a private prison operator, for instance. Is the function regulatory in nature? So some organisations, which are not government, have certain regulatory functions. For example, the Law Society of New South Wales, or certain other regulatory bodies that would be monitoring performance of their professional members. And also relevant is, does the organisation receive public funding to perform that particular function? Now, some of the services that have been recognised as non-government bodies performing functions of a public nature, they include homeless services, social housing services, non-government social housing services, public health services, emergency services, organisations performing regulatory functions, detentions and correction services, including private prisons, disability services, and youth services. So you can see that the obligations to comply with the human rights requirements in those acts extends quite significantly into the non-government realm. And this goes back to what Amrit and Paula were saying about the notion of duty bearers in terms of securing and advocating and protecting human rights for service users. So if we look at particularly some of the non-government service provider organisations, I think it's important to look at particularly how the human rights charters have improved service delivery. Now, I'm going to focus particularly on the Victorian Human Rights Charter. It's the area that, and the charter that I'm most familiar with in terms of my research and obviously in my professional career, but also because the Queensland Human Rights Act is still so new, it's difficult to have evaluated how it's been taken up by non-government organisations. But we've got a large body of evidence from Victoria that shows how the Human Rights Charter has improved service delivery for non-government organisations. And particularly looking at some of the community and non-government social housing organisations, which was a particular area and focus of research for mine. What we've seen is that those organisations have embodied the Charter by ensuring that principles such as non-discrimination, privacy, procedural fairness, consumer participation, service user participation are reflected in the policies, practices and guidance notes of those organisations. Also, those organisations have used the Charter to ensure that there's a comprehensive internal consumer complaints process that accords with notions of procedural fairness and privacy, and includes appropriate appeal mechanisms as well. As Paula indicated at the end of her presentation, complaints are a good thing. They are indicative of service users who feel empowered, who feel strengthened, and have a stake in improving the quality of service of those organisations. So ensuring that there's an appropriate process in place for those complaints to be fielded, to be respected, and to be acted upon. Ensuring that all policies, procedures, and practices are reviewed and audited to ensure that they respect human rights as well. So most organisations have a process of periodically reviewing their policies and procedures and practices. It's ensuring that that process is undertaken through a human rights lens. A really important aspect is reviewing key practice decision-making processes to ensure they took account of human rights. Now, one of the key aspects, particularly in non-government social housing organisations and community housing organisations, was looking at decisions relating to warnings to tenants or the notion of no-fault arbitrary evictions. So where decisions such as those were made to ensure that there was an appropriate account taken of human rights, that, for instance, no one would be arbitrarily evicted into a situation of homelessness, that there would be appropriate facilities in place to ensure that that person would have access to other accommodation options, or otherwise the person would not be evicted. Developing a system of internal monitoring and reporting and staff supervision so that where incidents arise that involve possible breaches of human rights or infringements of human rights, or a failure to take human rights into consideration, that there's a process within the organisation to monitor and equip staff with the necessary tools so that those sorts of incidents are kept to a minimum and ideally to be prevented completely. And importantly, most of all, is that organisations ensured that staff have access to human rights training so that staff are aware of their human rights duties, their human rights obligations, but also how to ensure that they properly actualise respect for human rights in the way that they carry out their duties. So to look at some of the examples of organisations and that were really successful in this regard, and the one that's often referred to in Victoria, Hanover Welfare Services, or what used to be known as Hanover Welfare Services, have presented at conferences in the way that they have implemented the Human Rights Charter into their operations and how it's improved their service delivery. So this is some of the things that Hanover Welfare Services have undertaken. A regular review of the level of understanding that their clients have about their rights. So they're also engaged with the process of ensuring that their service users are informed about their human rights as they enter the service, as they utilise the services of Hanover Welfare Services. To review all position descriptions and letters of appointment to staff to ensure that their obligations and rights under the Charter are included. So it's recognising that all appointments of staff, they have obligations as rights duty bearers, but they also have rights themselves under the Charter as employees as well. To making sure that there was a regular review of the rules of the service involving client representation, consumer representation, and participation in the service, including that human rights compliance notes are included in case notes or other internal audits as well, including that human rights obligations are included in all caseworker supervision practices. So it becomes part of that element of staff supervision and staff training to make sure that staff are continually aware of their human rights obligations and where they might be facing difficulties or challenges in that human rights space. Now, I'm always a little bit cautious when we see the word checklist because that implies a certain ticker box regulatory compliance. but I think it has to be recognised that they can be really useful tools. So developing a human rights checklist to be used when there's going to be any evictions that need to occur to ensure that any decision relating to a termination of a social housing situation, that decision is mindful of all the human rights elements involved in that decision as well. So it's not saying that an eviction will necessarily be always contrary to human rights, but there has to be a process of considering what human rights issues are relevant and whether they've been complied with. And only if there's been a satisfaction that human rights have been complied with in making that decision would that decision be considered lawful under the Charter. So looking at some of the other examples that we've seen in organisations, just how they identified human rights obligations as an opportunity to improve service delivery. When the Human Rights Charter was about to be implemented in Victoria, the Salvation Army in Victoria undertook an extensive project to look at how their practice and their policies would need to be adapted in relation to ensuring human rights compliance in the Charter. Determining how the Charter related to the creation and provision of their social programs. So what relevance and in what ways did the Charter intersect with their service delivery in their social program? And also ensuring that there was appropriate training and information to all their staff and their participants in their social programs to ensure that the information and their service delivery was in line with the Charter's principles. In addition, we look at an example in women's health in the western suburbs of Melbourne, how they use the Charter to establish a particular project to inform and support migrant women to understand their rights, to assist them and to facilitate them to exercise leadership in their communities and in their particular engagements with other community organisations, so that there was an increased rights awareness within the community. And what was important here is that not only Women's Health West saw their obligations as duty bearers in terms of their own service provision, but also informing and empowering their service users to be human rights advocates themselves, both for their use of services with Women's Health West, but in also their using of other services for other community organisations, as they recognised that it would make a difference in terms of fostering a general culture of human rights within the community that would allow similar projects to really flourish within the community. Another example how the Human Rights Charter really facilitated a non-government organisation, its service delivery, in terms of the advocacy role that it supported. So recognising that they found the Charter to be of Good Shepherd Youth and Family Services in St Kilda recognised that the Charter was of enormous use in terms of their advocacy work, particularly when they were looking to secure housing for people recently released from custodial settings, recently released from prison, raising the Charter in negotiations with non-government business operators who wish to remove homeless persons from outside their services, using the Charter to run sessions and programmings, outlining the various needs and associated rights with different marginalised communities that they worked with, women who face violence, women who are facing trafficking and forced labour. So they saw that it was an important opportunity to improve their community education programs, their advocacy programs, and the work that they did with particular disadvantaged people in the community in terms of securing housing and a right to public space. It's important to recognise, though, that when we're talking about human rights, it's essentially how it benefits the service user, that they are really the focus of improving human rights, to ensuring that their rights are protected and promoted. And I'll give you some examples at some very accessible levels, some accessible examples of how human rights were used by disadvantaged people, by particular people in circumstances that really also assisted the services themselves to improve their processes to become human rights compliant. So we can see a number of examples in Victoria how the Human Rights Charters was used particularly to protect from eviction from housing services or from boarding houses, rooming houses as they're referred to in Victoria, particularly in the space of no-fault terminations, no-fault evictions. And we can see, for instance, in the first example, where newly arrived refugee siblings were protected from eviction, that the non-government housing service, after there was advocacy using the Charter to suggest that the termination was unlawful, the housing service itself agreed and actually changed their approach in this circumstance. So in that sense, it provides an important preventative role. These matters don't necessarily have to go to court. They can be employed in negotiation that then ultimately leads to the non-government service provider to improve their processes as a whole. The young man protected from homeless facing a no reason notice to vacate by a community housing organisation. And we can see there that through the advocacy by using the Charter, a settlement was negotiated for the young man, who was then provided with an additional 2 months to find alternative accommodation. So in that sense, the no-fault termination was delayed. There was assistance given to him to find alternative accommodation. The service was able to satisfy its concerns as well. But by adopting a human rights approach to this decision-making process, it improved for better outcomes for the service user as well. There's a further example there of a notice to vacate from a home for a very elderly woman who was given a 60-day notice to vacate. And again, we see an example of how the Charter was used to basically provide this woman with an additional 30 days to assist in finding appropriate accommodation. Another couple of examples that I wish to draw on, and I might go to the one on the right first, because it is such an accessible example where, in relation to a non-government disability residential support service, there was concerns about the lack of respect for a resident's right to privacy in terms of the physical environment, and the fact that there was no privacy for the resident to have a shower. And it's a very, very basic element of how, just providing some advice to the service was able to improve their approach. Very simple solution, just fitting a shower curtain, guaranteeing the privacy and dignity of the resident at very little cost to the service. It's an example of how just some thought as to what processes, what human rights thinking a service needs to adopt to ensure that the rights of their service users are given the respect and acknowledgement that are warranted and required in these circumstances. And then the example on the right is another example of how in a termination proceeding, in this case in relation to a rooming house, there was obviously concerns about the behaviour of the resident, but the behaviour was arising from the tenant's disability, that the Charter was used in an advocacy context to ensure that the tenant, as long as the tenant complied with the requirements for a period of 6 months while looking for alternative accommodation, he could stay in the service for a further 6 months. And then what we see then is that the situation was able to be resolved. So rather than having a an approach that breached the tenant's human rights, that potentially put the person into a state of homelessness, a human rights approach actually worked with the tenant, with the person concerned, that actually resulted in that person maintaining their accommodation. So these are just examples how, in incorporating a human rights approach into the processes of an organisation, it actually can lead to better service delivery, ultimately a less stressful environment for the organisations themselves, but most importantly of all, that the rights of service users themselves are protected. And I think in this regard, I want to come back to where I started, that community organisations involved in service delivery to the most disadvantaged in community have a really important role to play in being the agents of change in improving the human rights protections for the community. And that is why we saw so many organisations in the non-government sector being such strong supporters to implement the Human Rights Acts in Victoria, the ACT and Queensland. So I really want to encourage you to be at the forefront, because that is where human rights culture can really start to happen in that service delivery context. And it's such an important part in engendering that dialogue around human rights that hopefully we will see resulting in change at the government level, which is why I want to finish with you with this call for you to be part of this campaign for a human rights charter in New South Wales, that you can sign up on the website as supporters for this campaign. Because as I said, I really think that you in your roles, in your organisations, can have such enormous influence in your communities to start this human rights dialogue that improves human rights culture across New South Wales. I'm going to leave you all there, and I'll be happy to take some questions as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for such great examples. We have one question. Who is holding governments to account?
Who is holding governments to account? Are we talking? Well, in New South Wales, this is the challenge, that with an absence of a Human Rights Act in New South Wales, it is very difficult to hold governments to account. It relies on organisations such as advocacy organisations who are involved in the advocacy process through parliamentary committees and through engagement with, through making submissions to parliamentary committees, holding the New South Wales government to account. In those states and territories that have a Human Rights Act, where government departments are also bound by the Human Rights Act, the importance of having access to advocacy organisations, community legal centres, the Human Rights Law Centre, the Tenants Union of Victoria, Homeless Persons Legal Service, they're the organisations that are most conspicuous in holding government departments to account in their respective service delivery operations, such as holding the Department of Housing to account, the Department of Health to account, holding police to account, as a prime example. There's also an important role for the Ombudsman's offices as well, and also the human rights commissions in those states as well, to be holding governments to account for their human rights compliance as well.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time. It's 12:30.
I'm Rich.
Over to Anna.
I just was speaking to Rosalita about this in the chat, and I'm not going to leave without acknowledging the tremendous amount of work that Rosalita has done to bring us all together to have this presentation. We're going to leave the Zoom open for a little bit, in part because just to give people an opportunity to have a chat if they want, or to see one another. I know that everybody's a bit over Zoom, and that, you know, I can't, but it's nice to have the opportunity to to connect with one another where it is possible. I'd like to thank our presenters for doing a spectacular job. It was really interesting and enlightening, and people stayed. One of the things you do when you've got a big Zoom group of people is you look at how many people have hung in for the long haul. So we've been above 50 participants from the get-go, which is really quite extraordinary. For me, there are a number of things that I think leads us into some very interesting conversations. The conversation about consultation, interaction, and co-design, I think, is one that is really worth exploring, Paula. Further, I was really interested. We do a lot of consultation, much of it with some of you, our members and stakeholders, and I was challenged about how I can move my consultation to being more how we do more interaction and rather than just consultation. I also think that there are it makes me think about opportunities for us to have more dialogue around this as well, because what the presentations really highlight for me is that embodying human, that for us to honour the human rights of our clients and to uphold them is really a dialogical process. Doesn't feel like it can be done without a dialogical process. So, and I'm happy to be corrected on that.